Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 2021 Inland Northwest Community Engagement Institute. My name is Anthony Medina, and I'm the Assistant Director for the Center for Community Engagement at Gonzaga University. I'm joined today by my incredible colleague and friend, Dr. Joe Johnston, who's Assistant Professor of Sociology here at Gonzaga and a deeply engaged service learning faculty member. For our session today, we wanted to take a look and introduce you to the critical service learning framework. Rooted in the work of community engagement scholar, Dr. Tania Mitchell, we will share her model for critical service learning, explore the importance of moving our practice beyond traditional forms of service learning, and share examples of how this framework may show up in our practice, our teaching, and our scholarship. Dr. Tania Mitchell is an associate professor of higher education in the Department of Organizational Leadership, Policy, and Development at the University of Minnesota's College of Education and Human Development, and is an internationally recognized scholar in service learning and community engagement practice. Our session today will draw heavily on her seminal work entitled Traditional versus Critical Service Learning, Engaging the Literature to Differentiate Two Models. On a personal note, this is one of my favorite models of community engagement, and I'm a huge nerd for this concept. So to understand critical service learning, we first need to look at what Dr. Mitchell calls traditional service learning. To begin, we focus on the center of this model and who or what is at the middle of this traditional service learning model. At the center of this model, we see the phrases learning to serve and serving to learn. What is implied here is that we are centering our student experience. Community engaged work in this context is squarely concerned with student learning and development over anything having to do with our actual communities. In some ways, this seems like it might make sense, right? We are, after all, institutions of higher ed with explicit missions of educating our students. But Dr. Mitchell points out some of the issues inherent in this model and how centering students solely can be troubling to our broader civic engagement and social justice goals implied in our service learning work. Some of these potential problems involve that this model may encourage work that privileges our student experience, that engages our community through a deficit-based lens, that lacks critical analysis and contextual examination. Work in this context may reinforce stereotypes as it looks at individuals over systemic concerns. It could perpetuate and reinforce traditional systems of power, and has a tendency to ignore experiences of students that come from these communities, come from the communities they're serving, or asks them to speak for or represent the community perspective. She shares that without the exercise of care and consciousness, drawing attention to root causes of social problems and involving students in actions and initiatives that address those root causes, our service learning experiences may have no impact beyond our students' good feelings, perhaps beyond our own good feelings. As faculty interested in service learning, as you reflect on this model, you may want to ask yourself, who is at the center of your model of community engagement? And is social justice implicitly or explicitly central to your service learning practice? Dr. Mitchell offers us a way forward, an alternative to this traditional model with critical service learning. Her model flips this paradigm and places our community at the center of the model. The community is represented by three core tenets. The first is bringing attention to social change, developing social change orientation. The second is working to redistribute power. And the third is developing authentic relationships. I'd like to delve into each of these tenets in a bit more detail and outline how they might show up in your classrooms and our community context. The first tenet is a social change orientation. And a social change orientation requires us as faculty and practitioners to rethink the ways in which we are engaged in our communities, as well as organizing our work in a way that challenges us to investigate and understand root causes of social problems and the types of actions and service learning experiences that are necessary to challenge and change the structures that perpetuate those issues in the first place. What might this look like in our classrooms, in your classrooms? Well, does our teaching practice create space and encourage students to reflect on the structural causes and concerns that necessitate their service in the first place? Do we provide opportunities for dialogue, reflections, and assignments that push students toward critical analysis and contextual examination of their service placements? Are they questioning why there's a need for service in the first place? Do we provide space for them to ask big questions? And are we asking those questions ourselves? Questions like, why do we have significant economic gaps between different racial groups in our country? Why do women continue to face economic and social inequities? Why does the richest country on earth have such a serious problem with homelessness? Why do people with developmental disabilities continue to be disproportionately excluded from the workplace? Why are environmental concerns, such as the water crisis in Flint, Michigan, allowed to persist in communities of colors, but not in predominantly white communities? Are the types of engagement we're asking students to serve with rooted in addressing these bigger questions? Or are our engagements and our solutions shallow in their understanding of our communities and therefore miss the mark? Or worse, inadvertently do harm because of our lack of awareness? The second tenet is working to redistribute power. Critical service learning names the differential access to power experienced by students, faculty, and community members, and encourages us to analyze and dialogue and discuss those power dynamics. In a classroom context, this means naming and being attentive to the power dynamics inherent within your class with the various constituents you work with and work for. This speaks as much to the faculty-student dynamic as it does to the faculty-community dynamic and the student-community dynamic. Illuminating issues of power in the service learning experience is rarely easy. It's uncomfortable, perhaps. It might mean challenging your own understanding of your own power and influence in this class. But it requires us to confront assumptions and stereotypes, own our own unearned privilege, and face inequality and oppression as something real and present in our work. Beyond naming these power differences, we're also asked to figure out ways to mitigate these dynamics so that we're interacting with our community in reciprocal and more just ways, in more authentic ways. If we're actively looking to embed critical service learning and avoid the default tendency we might have to privilege the needs of students above those in our community, we will seek and look for service learning actions that seek mutual benefit for our partners and our students, striving to listen to our partners and co-create opportunities that meet community identified needs. In our work, we call this reciprocity. This also means looking to knowledge from community members, wisdom sources, and from our students themselves. As faculty, how does our curriculum and our teaching practice honor different ways of knowing? Do we think about our community partners as co-educators in our work? And do we treat them as such? For our reflections, do they include opportunities to discuss how power relationships are produced and reproduced over and over again? Do we challenge ourselves and our students to act in ways that reconfigure those power relationships, that provide alternatives for how we've done things in the past? Finally, the third tenet is developing authentic relationships. The focus on developing authentic relationships, relationships based on connection, is an important element of this model. How are we and our students engaging with our communities authentically, with humility and a real desire to know and be known? Do we make time for that? Do we have time for that? Many times, when engaging in community-based work, it's easy to relate across difference or surface-level similarities. Dr. Mitchell shares that most of our relationships across difference are squarely rooted in relationships of domination and subordination. We're used to these kinds of relationships. Even if we're uncomfortable with them, we're used to them. But we have much less experience relating to people as different but equal. Instead of relating in this way, how might we learn to see our differences as categories of connections and encourage our students to do the same? Places from which to analyze power, build coalition, and develop empathy for one another. Developing common goals and shared understanding with our community partners can create mutuality, respect, and trust, which we hope will lead to authenticity. I think that's what we're talking about authenticity. Reciprocity seeks to create an environment where we all learn from one another. We're all teachers and learners. This emphasizes a collaborative relationship that seeks to involve all parties equally in our work. We don't do things for or to our community. We do things alongside them. And we do things alongside them, in my opinion, as co-conspirators for a better world. In the community, this looks like maintaining good communication. Dr. Mitchell shares that authenticity is built on good communication between campus and community partners, beginning with appropriate preparation for the relationship, continuing with ongoing dialogue to provide opportunities to share information, exchange feedback, and evaluate the partnership. You're constantly checking in on this relationship, right? Do we have lines of communication with our partners as faculty, as practitioners? If so, do we nurture that communication well? This also might look like developing authentic relationships with our students through dialogue, awareness, self-awareness, critical reflection, and solidarity, doing the work with them. Do we communicate and signal that we are in this with our students? Do our conversations challenge students to confront stereotypes and generalizations they encounter in the community and avoid simplistic or either-or conclusions? How might we encourage further action on the issues that students encounter in the service experience that extend beyond the last day of class, that get beyond the semester or the academic year, that work within realistic timelines for our community partners rather than are convenient solely for ourselves? Part of the reason I think this model is so meaningful is because it suggests that when we center community, particularly with these three tenets in mind, our engaged work in the community might no longer substitute generosity or charity for social justice. We might still continue to do the work that responds to immediate needs, but we're realistic and we're honest about the limits of this work. We also seek to create service learning experiences that respond meaningfully to systemic and structural injustice and give our students a way forward to deal with and process these really large, complex issues in our world. By centering community in our practice as faculty and community engagement practitioners, we are able to model the kind of engagement that I think leads to deeper, more relevant learning outcomes that service learning is capable of producing, but doesn't always produce. So that's a little overview of the critical service learning model by Tania Mitchell. For those interested in reading Dr. Mitchell's work in full, I've included the reference here. I suggest you do. It's a 16-page read. It's really, really worth it, but you can decide that for yourself. But I do want to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Joe Johnston, to share a bit about how this framework has shaped his teaching practice and scholarship. So Joe.
Thanks so much, Anthony. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here today, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation that we have in May. So basically what I'd like to try to talk about today are two different community engagement opportunities that I've been involved with for several years before the COVID-19 pandemic. One's something called the Walking School Bus Program, and the second is the Justice in January immersion, Both of these are connected to either classes or sort of experiences that are housed in the Center for Community Engagement here at Gonzaga University. But importantly, these two are two very different community engagement models. As I'll describe shortly, the walk-in school bus is something that happens all year long, and Justice in January is a very focused, intensive learning experience along the U.S. Mexico border for just a week. So how do we attempt to apply Tania Mitchell's framework in these different kinds of spots? And importantly, the title there, Attempted Critical Community Engagement, is important to say, because these are my attempts to put some of these ideas into practice over the last few years. So what is the walking school bus? It is an opportunity for volunteers to enjoy early in the morning walks with elementary school youth by going and picking them up at designated times, and then having the walking school bus grow and grow over time. As more and more students are added to the walking school bus, more and more conversations are had with community members and family members and those kinds of things. Coming on back to the school, the volunteers sit and sit while the youth eat breakfast at the school. So it's an opportunity that is supposed to be about accompaniment. So it's supposed to be about creating community in those early morning hours. It's supposed to lead to increased attendance and timeliness for the participants on these routes. So here's an example of a route map from 2018 from one of our elementary school partners. So all the volunteers that were Gonzaga students that I'll talk about here shortly would arrive at the elementary school by 7 a.m. And then there were 3 different routes that the students would go out onto. So this is an example of the blue route, where the students would walk all the way down through the neighborhood to the first house or the first pickup location, and then pick up students at different spots, weaving through the neighborhood on the way back to school that day. So the walking school bus is something that accompanied or has accompanied one of the classes that I teach at Gonzaga called Sociology of Education. It's an upper division sociology elective, which is focused on understanding the causes and consequences of inequalities in our K through 12 American public educational system. One of the things that I think is distinctive about that subfield is it's really focused on structural understandings of those inequalities, inequities. So that is the ways things that happen outside of the schools themselves really shape the makeup and the conditions and all that goes on within a school. So even for the most skilled instructors, simply identifying and recounting ways in which those structures are produced doesn't allow students to actually experience that structure. And then how do we get students to then communicate their understandings of those experiences in emotionally resonant kinds of ways? So the walking school bus, I think, is a very clearly sociological kind of program because it allows students to be immersed in things in a neighborhood, and the neighborhood makes up the composition of the school itself, experiencing those kinds of things that are going on outside of the school, and then moving inside the school to see and be part of that breakfast routine before school begins. So I've taught this class a few different times over the last few years at Gonzaga, starting in the fall of 2015. I became involved with the walking school bus program as a volunteer during my first year here in Spokane, Washington. So in 2016, 2017, spent a lot of time trying to come down to the Center for Community Engagement and admitting I have no idea what community engaged learning is, and try to get the expertise and assistance from many of the knowledgeable staff there in our Center for Community Engagement. So trying to create or couple the walking school bus with my Sociology of Education class. So in the spring of 2017, tried that for the first time. And we were partnered with 2 elementary schools. And one of the things that I thought was going to be a really great idea was having the students kind of split their time between 2 different schools. That was a really bad idea because it went against many of the things in Dr. Tania Mitchell's framework, which I can talk about here in a second. So in the spring of 2018, we adopted a different model where the students were going to spend the entirety of their time at one school on one route. And then going forward from there, we went forward and had route leaders. So originally it was random compositions of students that were volunteering 3 days a week. The route leaders were there 5 days a week, so every day of the week. They drove vans over from Gonzaga University. They were there every single second of every day on the route. They were providing constancy and modeling relationality. And they had regular reflective check-ins with me, both back here at Gonzaga, but when I was out on the routes as well, I would jump around to talk with everyone. And then in the spring of 2019, we expanded this to 3 schools and even more routes and route leaders. So is there any of these tenets that Anthony introduced actually being applied in this community engaged kind of way? So Anthony identified this idea of developing authentic relationships. Some of the ways we've tried to do that is through the route leaders and the intentionality with those route leaders. Some of the route leaders spend multiple years with the same students, the same route, really getting to know and learning through that. But I think one of the things that I continue to wonder about from Tania Mitchell's framework is, what does an authentic relationship actually look like? What does it feel like? How can we describe that? So are these relationships actually just not transactional or less transactional, or are they actually authentic? And importantly, a lot of what I've done so far is to try to make sense of whether they're authentic from the student perspective, but are they actually authentic from other kinds of perspectives? Working to redistribute power. The walking school bus at its core is supposed to be about the elementary school youth and their families introducing and teaching us about their neighborhood in a walk through that neighborhood in the morning. But inherently, there are age divides between the volunteers and the youth. There are power divides by us coming into the neighborhood and the things that we're bringing to that space. In terms of developing a social change orientation, I've done a good bit of work to try to be more intentional about providing student reflective spaces and asking students to write in multiple different points about how their lives are going to be adapted and changed going forward because of this community engaged experience. But how do we move those reflective kind of comments, even if they're embodied by the students, into action going forward? All right, another one, and I'll try to do this a little bit more quickly, is the Justice in January trip. So this is an immersion trip that's really focused on learning, and it is planned and led by the service immersion coordinator at Gonzaga University and 2 student leaders for each site. So in January, going down with those student leaders and a couple faculty or staff advisors, about 10 to 12 people at each site location. And eventually this grew to 3 site locations in San Diego, Tijuana, in Tucson, Nogales, and El Paso, Juarez. So I got involved with this trip in 2017. I went on the Justice in January trip with the intent to try to create a class. One of the things in talks with the service immersion coordinator was that there's just so much complexity with immigration and the borderlands that we wanted to create some kind of trip so that students could have some baseline set of knowledge for going out and being more thoughtful and perhaps critical in their questions on their week-long immersion trip. So the first attempt at this, there were no post-trip kinds of planning. It was just 8 weeks leading up to the trip itself. And we just had a single kind of debrief session a couple weeks later where there were pictures shown, there were optional sort of student-led next steps, and there were nothing really required that first time with the experience. If we fast forward to just the last time that I went on this trip in 2020, right before the pandemic, this was the third attempt at a class. And this was the time where the first time we added this third site location that I mentioned a moment ago. So there were still these 8 pre-trip sessions. But after that, we tried to intentionally have 4 post-trip sessions as well, where we tried to collectively process our experiences. Then students were required to complete a humanizing, accompanying, and complicating post-trip reflection. Then there was a co-sponsored event with the Student Body Association where community members, staff, faculty, students came to learn from both student leaders, but also volunteers that were interested in sharing about their experiences. Then student leaders tried to present, where do we go from here? And then there were presentations by each of these Justice in January groups about their thoughts and plans going forward. So here, once again, is a much different kind of community engagement opportunity. How do we develop authentic relationships? On the one hand, there's developing authentic relationships with the students and people you're going on the trip with. But how authentic can a relationship be between students and community members in the borderlands in a week? At the same time, there are the long-term relationships that are developed through these trips year after year. So how do you make those as intentional as possible? Working to redistribute power in the planning for this trip, it was always focused on trying to learn from those working with and those most directly affected by the borderlands and the immigration system. But how do you do that effectively without burdening those individuals with the learning that the students are wanting from those experiences? And then finally, developing a social change orientation, the tension between guiding students into what we kind of want them to do after versus student-led creation of the kinds of things that they want to do with community partners in their own lives going forward from that time. All right,